On the night of March 11, 1942, four PT boats slipped out of Sissamon Cove on the Bataan Peninsula, carrying the most consequential cargo any small American naval vessel would carry in the entire war. General Douglas MacArthur, commander of United States Army forces in the Far East, his wife Jean, his 4-year-old son Arthur, the boy's Chinese nurse, and a select group of senior officers and staff were aboard, attempting a 560-mile voyage across open and Japanese-controlled water to reach the island of Mindanao, from which they hoped to fly to Australia. The boats were 77 feet long, built of plywood, designed for high-speed torpedo attacks in protected coastal waters, and entirely unsuited by design for an open ocean transit of this distance carrying this kind of cargo. They had no air conditioning, minimal stores capacity, and engines that demanded constant maintenance even under ideal conditions. The conditions they would face were not ideal. They would face a typhoon, a Japanese naval blockade, mechanical failures, and navigation problems, severe enough that one boat would become permanently separated from the others during the crossing. This is the story of how 4 wooden boats, and the men who commanded them, carried out one of the most consequential evacuations of the Second World War, why it was necessary, what it actually demanded of the boats and their crews, and what happened to the men who made it possible. To understand why this evacuation occurred at all, you need to understand the military catastrophe that had been unfolding in the Philippines since December 8, 1941. Japanese forces had invaded the Philippines within hours of the Pearl Harbor attack, and the American and Filipino defense had been steadily collapsing since that first day. MacArthur's forces had withdrawn to the Bataan Peninsula and the fortified island of Corregidor in Manila Bay, conducting a defense that was heroic in its persistence and hopeless in its strategic position. No reinforcement was coming. The Japanese had naval and air superiority across the entire theater. Supplies were dwindling. Disease and malnutrition were spreading through the defending forces faster than Japanese bullets. Everyone involved understood, by February 1942, that Bataan and Corregidor would eventually fall. President Franklin Roosevelt made the decision that MacArthur should not be captured. The political and propaganda value of America's most prominent general becoming a Japanese prisoner of war was considered unacceptable, and Roosevelt ordered MacArthur to proceed to Australia to take command of the broader Southwest Pacific Theater that was being organized as the war's strategic center of gravity shifted. MacArthur resisted this order initially, believing his place was with his men on Bataan, and the order had to be repeated in increasingly explicit terms before he accepted that leaving was not optional. The plan for getting MacArthur out of the Philippines, codenamed Operation Plum, faced an immediate and severe problem. Every conventional means of evacuation was either unavailable or prohibitively dangerous. Surface ships large enough to make the journey safely either did not exist in the theater or could not get through the Japanese naval blockade that had effectively sealed off the Philippines from outside relief. Submarines could potentially make the trip, but were needed for other critical missions and could not easily accommodate the number of people who needed to be evacuated. Aircraft were the eventual solution for the final leg from Mindanao to Australia, but no aircraft in the theater had the range or the available landing strips to fly directly from Corregidor. The solution that emerged was PT boats, specifically the 4 boats of Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 3 that remained operational in the Philippines under the command of Lieutenant John Bulkley. Bulkley was 29 years old, a Naval Academy graduate, and by March 1942, already one of the most experienced and aggressive small boat commanders in the Pacific Theater. His squadron had been conducting harassment operations against Japanese shipping in Philippine waters since the war began, operating from increasingly battered facilities as Japanese air attacks destroyed their support infrastructure piece by piece. By the time Operation Plum was conceived, Bulkley's squadron had already demonstrated its capability and its willingness to take on missions well beyond what the boats had originally been designed for. The 4 boats selected for the evacuation were PT-34, PT-35, PT-41, and PT-32. Each was an Elco-built 77-foot motor torpedo boat, powered by 3 Packard Marine engines, producing a combined output that could theoretically drive the boat to speeds above 40 knots in calm water and good mechanical condition. By March 1942, none of the 4 boats were in good mechanical condition. Months of combat operations, inadequate spare parts, and the impossibility of proper maintenance under siege conditions had left every engine in the squadron operating well below its rated performance. The boats that would carry MacArthur to Mindanao were tired machines being asked to perform the most demanding mission of their careers. The specific arrangements for the evacuation were finalized in the days immediately before departure. MacArthur would travel on PT-41, with Bulkley himself commanding. His wife, his son, and the boy's nurse would also be aboard PT-41. The remaining passengers, senior staff officers, and their essential equipment would be distributed across the other 3 boats. The plan called for the boats to travel together as a group for mutual support and navigation assistance, making the crossing primarily at night to minimize the risk of detection by Japanese aircraft and surface patrols, and finding sheltered anchorages during daylight hours where possible. The boats departed Sissaman Cove at approximately 9:30 in the evening on March 11th. MacArthur's departure from Corregidor itself had been a deliberately understated affair, conducted without the kind of ceremony that the general's prominence might otherwise have generated, both for security reasons and because the symbolism of the commanding general leaving his besieged forces was not something anyone involved wanted to draw additional attention to. MacArthur reportedly stood on the deck of PT-41, looking back at Corregidor as the boat pulled away, and accounts from those present describe a man who understood exactly what he was leaving behind and what it would mean for the men who remained. The voyage that followed over the next 2 nights and the day between them tested every limit the boats and their crews possessed. The first major obstacle was weather. The boats encountered a significant storm during the crossing, with seas rough enough that the small, low freeboard PT boats were taking water over their decks and pitching violently enough to make movement aboard difficult and dangerous. MacArthur's wife Jean and the other passengers aboard PT-41 experienced seasickness severe enough that contemporary accounts describe most of the passengers as physically incapacitated for significant portions of the journey. The 4-year-old Arthur MacArthur, remarkably, appears to have tolerated the rough seas better than most of the adults aboard. The mechanical strain on the boat's engines during the storm and the subsequent high-speed running required to maintain the schedule was severe. PT boats were not designed for sustained operation in significant sea states, and running at any meaningful speed through rough water placed stresses on the hull, the engine mounts, and the propulsion systems that the boat's designers had not optimized for. The Packard engines, already operating below their rated performance due to months of inadequate maintenance, were being asked to perform under conditions that would have stressed engines in full mechanical health. The second major problem was navigation, and the simple physical challenge of keeping 4 boats together across open water at night without modern navigation aids beyond compass, dead reckoning, and the experience of the boat commanders. During the first night's run, the boats became separated in the darkness and rough seas. This was not a minor inconvenience. It meant that boats carrying critical personnel and limited fuel were now operating independently in waters controlled by the Japanese Navy, each commander having to make his own decisions about course, speed, and where to seek shelter during the daylight hours when continued movement risked detection by Japanese aircraft. PT-32, commanded by Lieutenant Vincent Schumacher, became separated from the other 3 boats during the first night and never successfully reconnected with the main group for the remainder of the voyage. This boat eventually made its own way toward the rendezvous point, with the personnel and cargo it carried, navigating independently through waters where a single Japanese patrol vessel encounter could have ended the mission and likely the lives of everyone aboard. The boats that remained together faced their own crisis when a Japanese destroyer was sighted during the crossing. The PT boat's entire tactical value depended on speed and the ability to avoid engagement with anything larger and better armed than themselves, which described essentially every Japanese naval vessel they might encounter in these waters. The boats took evasive action, running at high speed away from the destroyer's apparent course and relying on darkness and distance to avoid detection. The encounter passed without direct contact, but it illustrated exactly how thin the margin for the entire operation actually was. A single alert Japanese lookout, a single moment of bad luck in the timing of the encounter, could have resulted in the capture or death of the American theater commander and his family in the middle of the ocean, an outcome that would have been an intelligence and propaganda catastrophe for the United States at one of the lowest points of the entire war. By the morning of March 13th, the surviving boats of the convoy, minus PT-32, which was still making its own way, reached the vicinity of the Cuyo Islands, where they anchored to rest the crews, conduct emergency maintenance on the badly strained engines, and wait for darkness before continuing. The condition of the boats at this point in the journey was a serious concern. PT-34 had developed significant engine problems that her crew worked to address using whatever tools and parts were available aboard, knowing that a serious mechanical failure in these waters meant either an extended and dangerous delay or potentially abandoning the boat entirely. The final leg of the journey to Mindanao required navigating through the most heavily patrolled waters of the entire route. Since the approaches to the southern Philippines were areas where Japanese naval activity was concentrated due to the ongoing operations against remaining American and Filipino forces in the southern islands. The boats made this final approach primarily during darkness, arriving at Cagayan on the northern coast of Mindanao in the early morning hours of March 13th. With PT-32 arriving separately some hours later after her own independent transit. The arrival at Mindanao did not end the danger or the difficulty of the evacuation. It simply transitioned the problem from a naval one to an aviation one. MacArthur and his party needed aircraft capable of making the long flight to Australia, and the aircraft initially designated for this mission, a flight of B-17 bombers, experienced its own series of failures and delays that nearly stranded the general and his family in the southern Philippines for an extended period that would have placed them at continued risk from Japanese forces actively searching for exactly this kind of high-value target. The first set were in such poor mechanical condition, the same systemic maintenance crisis that had degraded every piece of American military equipment in the theater, that MacArthur reportedly refused to board one of them after inspecting its condition, considering it unsafe for the journey. A second attempt with different aircraft, flown by more experienced crews and in better mechanical condition, succeeded in transporting the party to Australia, completing a journey that had begun on a PT boat deck in Manila Bay and had nearly failed at multiple points along the way, through mechanical failure, weather, separation, and the constant background risk of Japanese detection. MacArthur reached Australia on March 17th, 1942. His famous statement upon arrival, that he had come through and that he shall return, became one of the most quoted phrases of the entire Pacific War and shaped the strategic narrative of the campaign that followed for the next 2.5 years until the actual return to the Philippines in October 1944. What happened to the men who made this evacuation possible, the crews of the PT boats and the boats themselves, deserves its own examination, because the historical narrative that celebrates MacArthur's escape often treats the boats and their crews as a footnote to the general's own story, rather than as the central actors who made the entire operation physically possible. The 4 boats that carried out Operation Plum did not survive the war as a group, and their individual fates illustrate the broader reality of PT boat service in the desperate early months of the Pacific War that the existing project scripts on PT boat service have already documented in detail. PT-41, the boat that had carried MacArthur himself, continued operating in Philippine waters after completing the evacuation mission. She was eventually destroyed, as were her sister boats, in the systematic destruction of Motor Torpedo. Boat Squadron 3's remaining assets as the Philippine campaign moved toward its final collapse in the following weeks. With no possibility of resupply, no functioning base infrastructure, and overwhelming Japanese naval and air superiority in the surrounding waters, the squadron's boats were used in continued harassment operations against Japanese forces for as long as they remained mechanically capable of operating, and were then deliberately destroyed by their own crews to prevent capture and exploitation by Japanese forces, in the same pattern that destroyed military equipment across the entire collapsing Philippine defense. Lieutenant John Bulkley, who had commanded the overall evacuation and personally commanded PT-41, survived the war and became one of its most decorated naval officers. He received the Medal of Honor specifically for his actions, commanding Motor Torpedo, Boat Squadron 3 during the defense of the Philippines, an award that explicitly recognized both his combat actions against Japanese shipping and his role in executing the MacArthur evacuation under extraordinarily difficult conditions. Bulkeley's subsequent naval career extended across decades and through the Korean War and into the nuclear era of the Navy, eventually retiring as a vice admiral, one of the longest and most distinguished careers of anyone who served in the PT boat force during the war's desperate opening months. The men who crewed the 4 boats during Operation Plum, the machinist's mates who kept the strained Packard engines running through the storm and the high-speed evasion of Japanese patrols, the gunners' mates who stood ready at their weapons throughout the crossing in case the boats were forced into a combat engagement they could not realistically win, and the junior officers who shared the navigation and command burden with Bulkeley and his fellow boat commanders performed their specific roles in an operation whose success or failure carried strategic weight far beyond what any of them could have fully appreciated in the moment. They were extracting a general they did not know in the specific hours of the crossing, when the engines were straining and the seas were rough and a Japanese destroyer's silhouette was visible on the horizon. That history would eventually treat their mission as one of the pivotal moments of the entire Pacific War. One of the men who served in Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 3 during this period, though not specifically assigned to one of the 4 boats that carried out the MacArthur evacuation itself, was machinist's mate First Class Harold Esau, who had served with the squadron since its arrival in the Philippines in the months before the war began, and who maintained the squadron's engines through the entire siege period and the eventual destruction of the boats. Esau was 26 years old when the war began. He had been assigned to the squadron's tender vessel and to shore-based maintenance facilities, working on the boat's engines between patrols throughout the entire Philippine campaign, including the critical maintenance period in the days before Operation Plum, when every available engineering hand was working to bring the 4 selected boats into the best possible mechanical condition for a mission whose details were known only to a small circle of officers, but whose general importance was understood by everyone involved in the preparation. He continued serving with the remnants of the squadron after the MacArthur evacuation, through the final weeks of the Philippine defense, maintaining whatever boats remained operational for as long as fuel, parts, and the deteriorating tactical situation permitted. When the order came to destroy the remaining boats to prevent their capture, Esau was among the men who participated in this final act, scuttling and burning vessels he had spent months keeping alive through conditions that had defeated most conventional military logistics. He was captured by Japanese forces during the final collapse of organized resistance in the Philippines, and spent the remainder of the war as a prisoner, surviving the brutal conditions of Japanese captivity that claimed the lives of a significant percentage of the Americans captured during the Philippine campaign. He was held in multiple camps over the following 3 years, including a period of forced labor that the post-war accounts of Pacific prisoners of war have documented extensively as among the most severe treatment any American prisoners experienced in either theater of the war. He survived to be liberated in 1945 and returned to the United States in poor physical condition, having lost a substantial portion of his body weight during captivity and having developed chronic health problems that would affect him for the remainder of his life. He settled in California after his discharge and worked for over 2 decades as a diesel mechanic, applying the same engineering skills he had used to keep PT boat engines running under siege conditions to civilian machinery in a peacetime economy that had no understanding of what he had done or what it had cost him. He rarely discussed his wartime experience in detail with his family. He died in 1979 at the age of 63, his health permanently affected by the years of captivity that followed his service maintaining the boats that had ultimately carried his theater commander to safety while he himself remained behind to share the fate of the men who could not be evacuated. His daughter, in an account provided to a California Veterans History Project in 1998, described her father as a man who kept a single photograph from his Navy service displayed in his workshop for his entire post-war life. It was not a photograph of himself or of any specific person. It was a photograph of a PT boat at speed, taken sometime before the war's desperate final months in the Philippines, when the boats were still functioning as the fast and capable vessels they had been designed to be, rather than the exhausted machines that the siege and the evacuation and the final destruction had eventually made of them. She said she had asked her father once what the photograph meant to him, and he had told her it reminded him of what the boats had been able to do when they were given a fair chance to do it. He said the boats that carried the general out had been falling apart by the time they made the crossing, held together by the specific stubbornness of the men who maintained them, and that the photograph showed him what those same boats had looked like before. 3 months of siege and inadequate parts and impossible maintenance conditions had worn them down to what they became. He said the general got out. He said that mattered. He said the boats and the men who kept them running deserved to be remembered for making it possible, and that he did not think most people who knew the story of MacArthur's escape ever thought about the engines at all. His daughter said she kept the photograph after he died. She said she understood now what he had meant. Did anyone in your family serve in the Philippines during the early months of the Pacific War, on PT boats or elsewhere? Drop their name in the comments. Let's make sure they are remembered.